Today I've got another video for you. This is going to be a direct comparison of the Sony A7 III and the latest version, the Sony A7 IV. My name is Mark Bergerine. I'm a photographer and filmmaker. I do some gear reviews here on YouTube, and today I think this is an interesting video because this is the latest version, this is the older version. A lot of people are going to be deciding between these two cameras, and hopefully I can help you make that decision. So I'm going to break this video up into a variety of categories, but basically we're going to talk through the build and the differences between these two cameras in terms of that, ergonomics, low light performance, image quality, value, and then I'll give you some closing thoughts. So first up, let's talk through the build and appearance. So there's been a number of improvements. With each new generation of camera, you always get some minor improvements, but I think there's been some pretty significant changes between these two generations of cameras. The Sony A7 III, I think it was released, it's been 4 years now, I think. 2018, that sounds about right. First thing that, these are in no particular order, but first thing is the eye cup and the automatic switch between the two. So the Sony A7 III, it worked pretty good when I first had it, but then I started noticing that when you switch between using the viewfinder and the back screen, sometimes it gets a little glitchy. This sensor is just not as good as the latest version. Has a sensor on the bottom, and it's just more responsive in terms of switching between the back screen and the eye cup, which I find myself doing a lot, when especially when I'm shooting overhead or down below and then bringing it back to my eye. I like to judge exposure through the viewfinder because it's a little more accurate. You don't get as much accuracy with the back screen just because it's lower resolution and it doesn't have as much contrast as I usually see through the viewfinder. Next up, they've changed a lot of the dials here on the top. So you're now getting, on the A7 IV, you get a dedicated record button, which you could always customize this older version, but it's nice to have that when you're shooting photo and video. But the biggest thing is now this selector switch. So it allows you to, there's a little switch on the front here, it allows you to switch between photo, video, and S&Q or slow and quick mode, which slow and quick just records slow motion directly to the memory card, and so when you play it back, it'll look like slow motion, whereas if you record slow motion in regular video mode, you have to change it when you go into your editing software down to, say, 20% if you're shooting in 120 frames per second. Additionally, the old exposure compensation dial is now unlabeled and can be customized to whatever you want. It has unlimited scroll, whereas this one only scrolls from -3 to +3 in terms of exposure compensation. Additionally, on this top menu here, you're getting 3 custom modes, whereas the previous version only had 2. So the A7 IV now has a total of 9 customizable modes when you compare photo, video, and S&Q times 3. You get those 9 modes. The problem I found with the A7 III was that when you switch between photo and video, your settings aren't necessarily separate. So that allows you, separating those allows you to shoot photo specific settings and video specific settings like picture profile, shutter speed, a lot of things that you would want specific to video and not have those settings for photo. Those are now completely separate if you customize it in the menu. In continuing with talking about the build quality, you now get a more robust feeling, a more robust feeling card door here. The A7 III, you kind of pull down on this switch and it pops open, but after a while these start to get a little sticky and they don't work quite as well. So that's a welcome improvement. Additionally, on the side here, these port doors are kind of floppy. So I like the new and improved version where they just kind of hang and are more stable. You're also getting USB-C charging, which this is the old micro USB, just upgraded. You're also getting a full-size HDMI port here in this door, which the previous version only had a micro HDMI port, which is just really kind of fragile And if you're gonna shoot a lot of video on this, you kind of have to have a cage to protect that port. The cage really locks in that cable and protects that port, whereas the full-size HDMI is just a little bit more durable and sturdy. Overall, I'd say the newer generation is just, the buttons are a little bit firmer, more tactile, more responsive, easier to use, as you would expect from an upgraded version. In terms of ergonomics and handling, both cameras handle quite well. I'd say, you know, as far as grip, the A7IV gives you a slightly deeper grip, so people with big hands might appreciate that. But they're both, you know, a similarly sized camera. Mirrorless is smaller, and if you're used to a DSLR, it's going to be a bit of a transition. But I think that the A7IV has a really nice feel to it. It's just a little bit nicer than the A7III. In terms of functionality, having this fourth customizable dial is a lot more friendly, personally, I think. I used to use this back dial for ISO on this version of the camera, the A7III, and that resulted in changing things like drive mode that I didn't intend to change when I was just trying to adjust my ISO. So now you've got 4 dials. I usually set this one to shutter speed, this one to aperture, and this one is now gonna be ISO. And that frees me up to set this rotating dial to whatever I want. I'm not sure what that'll be yet, but I will probably be making a settings video similarly like I did to the A7S III for the A7IV, so keep an eye out for that. A few other things to note when just using the camera in terms of handling. The eye cup is sturdier on the newer generation. I've lost a ton of these. They slide off really easily, and then you end up without an eye cup, which is just less comfortable to shoot. And when you're out in a bright, sunny environment, you'll notice what a difference it makes to have a proper eye cup on there. Another thing I noticed is silent shutter transition. So on the newer version, the A7IV, you can just press this bottom button and quickly switch between silent shutter on and off. Whereas with the A7III, you press that button and then you have to select on or off in a little menu that pops up. So that's just more quick and faster in terms of turning on and off silent shutter. Another feature that is pretty practical is the fact that you can, when you power off the camera, you can now have the shutter close, and that'll keep your sensor cleaner when you're changing lenses. A7III doesn't offer that. I think it's a pretty handy feature so that if you don't have time to blast off your sensor all the time, it saves you time in post because you're not cloning out as many spots in your images. Lastly, the newer version, as you would expect, is a lot faster to boot up. So this camera takes like 8 to 10 seconds to boot up, the A7III, whereas the A7IV will boot up in less than 2 seconds. You can be firing away, and that helps for people that are shooting in fast-paced environments. If you like to turn off your camera to save battery, you can fire it back up and take pictures more quickly. Next up, let's talk focus, autofocus. The A7IV has the focus system from the Sony A1, which is just the latest and greatest. The autofocus on the A7III is pretty good. When I initially bought it, I was really happy with it. Over time, you know, you get used to the quirks of a camera, and I really appreciate the new autofocus system in the A7IV. You get that touch to track where you can tap with the touch screen on the back and track an object through the frame. That's super handy. You also get really effective eye and face detect autofocus, which the A7III did pretty good at, but the A7IV is just faster, more responsive. They're saying it does like 120 focus calculations per second, which is crazy, but you can imagine that just improves the tracking performance when you're shooting at some of those higher frame rates. One other thing in terms of focus is the higher performance sensor in the A7IV is going to allow you to focus in low light just a little bit more effectively. So in addition to shooting in low light, which I'll talk about in a moment, you're going to get a little bit better autofocus. So let's talk low light performance or high ISO performance out of these sensors. So generally, I try not to push the A7III past about 6400. Sometimes I'll push it to 12,800. But basically you're getting an extra stop of performance out of the A7 IV, even with the increase in resolution to 33 megapixels, which would usually lend you to think that it would get a decrease in high ISO performance, but they've managed to increase the resolution and the ISO performance, which is awesome. So generally, I try to keep this thing topped out at 12,800, but in a pinch, you can stretch it to 25,600 and still get pretty usable images, especially if you're gonna convert them to black and white and reduce some of that digital noise. In terms of image quality and sensor size, you're getting 24 megapixels with the A7 III, 33 megapixels with the A7 IV. So that bump in resolution is just gonna give you more flexibility for cropping, or if you like to use the APS-C mode. So either you have some APS-C lenses, those crop sensor lenses, or if you like to switch between crop mode and full frame mode and kind of get two focal lengths out of one prime lens. It is just a digital crop, but sometimes it allows you to frame your images a little better. 33 megapixels is just gonna give you more flexibility. I thought 24 megapixels was great. I've used this camera for quite a while now, and I really like 24 megapixels. It's a solid resolution. It doesn't clog up your hard drives, but I am excited to try out 33. I've always thought that 30 megapixel range would be an interesting improvement in resolution, while not stepping up to like the A7R series where you're getting significantly more resolution. I had an A7R III, but I found that it was just clogging up my hard drives. I'd fill up like 250 gigabyte cards and it was just too much data. I never really made that large of prints and I didn't need that much resolution. Additionally, you're getting a slight bump in dynamic range. They're claiming up to 15 stops on the new A7 IV, which I think is improved from the A7 III. We'll see what the third-party review comes in at. I always thought the dynamic range on the A7 III was awesome and exceeded my expectations, so I'd say the two are probably gonna be pretty comparable, because by the time you get up to, 14 stops of dynamic range, that's plenty in my opinion. There's not a whole lot of situations where I want to go beyond that. It starts to look a little bit more HDR, and I think that the A7 III had excellent dynamic range. In terms of video features, out of the sensor, one big thing that people are going to be talking about is the fact that the A7 IV now shoots 4K 60 frames per second, but it does it with a 1.5x crop factor. So that really kind of changes the perspective in terms of if you're switching between photo and video, you're gonna need a much wider lens in order to get the same look out of that 4K 60 video. The A7 III only shoots 4K 30 frames per second, so you're getting double the frame rate, but it comes at the cost of a crop factor. If you're really looking for video-centric features, you probably want to look more towards the A7S III. That's going to provide that full frame up to 120 frames per second in 4K. So I think they're making a bit of a compromise here with the A7 IV. It does have improved color science. That's especially true with some of the picture profiles that are available now. The A7 III has always had what I think is really good color, but if you're trying to match, say, the A7S III, like I'm shooting on right now, the A7 IV is going to provide the ability to match that color in post for video. A few other useful features. This camera just has some improvements that I think are interesting. So one of the big things that people complained about with the A7 III is the menu system. So now you're getting an upgraded menu system. It's touch scroll compatible. It's a lot better organized. But it still has a ton of features. So if you really want to get the most out of either of these cameras, you really have to dig into the menu and customize things to suit your needs. There's a lot of cool features hidden in the menu, like shockless white balance, or closing your sensor when you closing your shutter when you power off the camera. You can use animal eye autofocus now on the Sony A7 IV. The A7 III did not have that. There's just a ton of cool features. You really have to dig into the menu to get the most out of this camera. Next up, let's talk value. So brand new, the Sony A7 III is selling for around $2,000. The Sony A7 IV is selling for $2,500. You could definitely pick up the A7 III used for like maybe $1,200 to $1,500. But I think the A7 IV is providing a lot of new features that make it very tempting, especially if you're into shooting video and if you want the latest and greatest in terms of autofocus and some of those little quirky features that make this camera just a little bit friendlier to use. When you compare the two cameras to each other, I think the A7 IV is going to be a better value. Unless you're on a really tight budget and you're going to pick up a A7 III used, I think if you're buying new, the A7 IV is definitely the better value. When you compare it to other systems like the Canon R6 or the Nikon Z6 II, the A7 IV seems a little bit on the pricey side, but I think as an entire system, it is cheaper because of the lenses that are available. Sony has a bunch of mirrorless specific lenses, and there's also a bunch of third-party lenses like Tokina, Samyang, Sigma. They're all making really high quality lenses for the Sony E-mount system. So in conclusion, I think the A7 IV is pretty awesome. Obviously, I've purchased it, but I will probably still be keeping my A7 III as a backup camera. I love the new autofocus, the ergonomics, the sensor, and a lot of those little features that have just improved my workflow with the new A7 IV. Hope that review was helpful for you. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. I'd love to know what you're thinking. If you have any specific questions about feature comparisons between these two cameras, let me know how I can help. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for being here. See you in the next one.